The guy cursed him out, totally deserved, and our hero apologized like a good boy. This is the sad, uneventful life of our dude. But while he was mentally complaining about how boring everything is, a loud, ridiculous noise shook the area and made everyone stop in their tracks. Before they could even figure out what was happening, boom! A second explosion. A giant yellow lightning bolt hit the ground just a few steps away and deep-fried a bunch of people. Everyone froze in absolute fear. The blast sent cars flying like paper planes. And then, because things weren't bad enough, more lightning bolts started falling. But these weren't your regular lightning strikes. No, these things were basically mini meteors. People ran like their lives depended on it. Spoiler, they did. What started as a weird event turned into an all-out lightning apocalypse across the entire city. Just imagine the destruction of one lightning bolt. Now multiply that by 10,000. Our poor protagonist was just one of the thousands sprinting for dear life. A girl near him was also trying to escape, and he saw a chance to finally be useful in life. He yelled for her to follow him to safety, but turns out she had more luck. An ambulance came by and stopped to help her. Now she didn't have to run for her life anymore. Actually, she didn't have to run at all, ever again. Our guy went back to running, crying partly from the trauma and partly because that was straight up terrifying. But fate wasn't done messing with him yet. Because right ahead, a huge truck was ready to isekai him into another dimension. And just before it could turn him into protagonist paste, something wild happened. A white flash blinded him, and he got sucked into a portal. A lightning bolt, just like the ones from before, crashed down in a totally different place where it was night. We don't know how much time passed, but we do know one thing: he survived. He woke up groggy and confused, still traumatized by Truck Kun. But his attention quickly shifted to something new. Where the hell is he? He looked up and saw something insane. The birds in the sky looked like monsters straight out of a horror game, and there were 2 moons. That definitely wasn't part of the Korea he remembered. That realization hit him harder than the lightning back in the city. And to make things worse, he was freezing. And not just hands and feet, I mean freezing everywhere. One thing's clear: this place, this is not Earth. Looking up, he becomes confused as there are several monsters surrounding the area. Confused, he asks himself what is going on, and moreover, why he has no clothes on. Shortly after, the young man stands up, seeming surprised by something, as he finds himself face to face with a giant bear. However, within seconds, he is attacked by a pack of wolves. Then the scene cuts to a doctor analyzing some data, saying that when he woke up, he was on a planet with 2 moons and a forest full of monsters, wondering how he managed to come back alive from such a place. However, the young man seemed to be apprehensive about something. A flashback of that bear being defeated appears. Then the wolves begin to devour the bear. The protagonist, watching it all, is desperate. Meanwhile, a white wolf is behind him. The boy suddenly notices the creature behind him. As a result, he starts running non-stop. To survive, he gave it everything he had. At that moment, a system informs him that his constitution has increased to level 1. Seeing all of this, the protagonist is confused, but he trips over a rock, starting to tumble downhill, falling off a cliff. However, the boy manages to grab onto some bushes, successfully staying alive, wondering what that sound from earlier had been. Looking around, he is surprised as he finds a kind of fruit in front of him, mentioning that he is very hungry and wondering if they are edible. But when he looks to the side, he notices some ants eating those fruits. So, without any remorse, he starts eating them. But at the same moment, he hears a noise in the bushes, and a creature with a piercing gaze is him. Then, a giant snake lunges at the boy, but within seconds, it is devoured by a giant frog. The young man watching all of this still cannot believe what he is seeing. That place is completely insane. But in reality, maybe he is the one who has gone mad. Time passes, and it has now been 67 days since he arrived in that place. Moreover, that pack of wolves from earlier has been following him and still hasn't given up. That's why the boy fears they might catch him off guard at any moment. Additionally, the forest has things far more dangerous than wolves, so he needs to find a safe place. Once again, time passes, and it has now been a year since he has been in that place. Looking up, the protagonist finds a giant banana, so he begins grabbing the big banana. The system alerts him that his strength has increased to level 1, and you can already see that the boy is quite ripped. As a consequence of everything happening around him, the protagonist has been forced to adapt. However, a wolf pup keeps insisting on chasing him at all costs. That's why he got so used to it that he even missed it when it wasn't around. Meanwhile, something seemed to be falling on the boy's back. Looking up, he notices something. His expression quickly changes because he had encountered a giant gorilla charging directly at him. However, the young man manages to dodge the attack, breaking the branch he was holding onto, saying he should have better luck next time. As a result, the gorilla falls to the ground, but it was heading towards that wolf and ends up hitting it. Meanwhile, the protagonist was watching everything. Soon after, the gorilla gets back up, looking at the wolf that was apparently injured, beginning to charge at it. However, the protagonist was already advancing towards the gorilla, landing an attack on its eye, but that still wasn't enough. So, the gorilla throws the boy, he collides with a tree. Quickly, the monster charges at him again. Irritated, the young man says that was a very stupid move on his part. The scene then cuts to the doctor, asking if the protagonist had really done all of that. The boy replies that he couldn't keep running away from territorial fights, and that wouldn't solve anything, because no matter where he went, there would always be a ruler. Returning to the scene, the protagonist was about to be attacked by the gorilla. However, the wolf ends up appearing to protect the young man. The boy becomes unconscious while the pack attacks the gorilla. He truly thought it was his end, but the wolves didn't attack him while he was unconscious, because they must have thought he saved the cub earlier, and that little one was the son of the Wolf King, leader of the Crimson Wolves. Time passes after that event, and those wolves were running towards that location. Alongside them, the protagonist, together with the wolves, was also running. Looking to the side, he notices that his friend was tired, so he picks him up and starts carrying him. Once again, time passes, and it's been 2 years since the boy had been there. That's why it seemed like they had accepted him into the pack. 3 years had passed since the young man was stranded, and he seemed to be developing his climbing skills. However, he was still in a forest, and in fact, he still hadn't managed to escape that place. Moreover, he hadn't found any civilization. Thus, he had become a member of the wolf family and continued participating in territorial battles for the survival of his family. Once again, time passes, and it's been 120 years since he was stranded. That's why he thought he was the only human on that planet. In a constant battle for survival, he ended up making more friends, but even so, he lost some companions. Wondering how long he had been stranded, because he had forgotten the date, and it seemed like hundreds of years had passed, wondering how he was still alive. The doctor then asks if, after becoming the king of the wolves, even after 500 years, he still hadn't found any civilization. That's why they wanted to know how he had managed to return to planet Earth. The boy replies that he had started a war against the gorilla race for the lunar hill. Thus, a giant battle broke out, and a protagonist was also in the middle of it, charging at one of the gorillas. However, something strange happens as he was teleported once again, and when he opens his eyes, he is in a different place. Meanwhile, a girl seems to be analyzing a radio, mentioning that something was very strange as the dimensional energy was off the charts. The other guy then asks her to send the coordinates to the portal control team, so the girl does as he requested. At that moment, a portal begins to open. Thus, everyone starts fleeing the area, and an explosion occurs, and that collision causes everyone to fall to the ground. Surprised because a portal had really opened, the other guy, desperate, says he doesn't want to die, and the other girl is already prepared for an attack, saying she will buy time so they should flee. The other guy then asks headquarters to send emergency reinforcements to that location. At that moment, the portal was in front of the girl. She then tells the person to get out of there as she was going to cut them to pieces. At that moment, a man's silhouette appears from the portal, leaving the girl completely shocked by what she saw, and as a result, she becomes paralyzed. At that moment, the man begins to scream, then he comes out of the portal. At that moment, the girl approaches the protagonist, and the other guy is surprised because it really was another person. The girl wonders what that force from earlier was all about, because it was a pressure she had never felt before, not even against monsters in high-level dungeons. She wondered what the protagonist was. Thus, the situation was resolved, and that boy was a returnee, so they should call the ambulance right away. Then the scene cuts again to the professor. He thanks the boy for everything. His testimony and medical examination would be shared with the awakened central office. For that reason, he seemed quite healthy and should be discharged in a few days. Shortly after, the boy calls the doctor again, saying it was the first time he had spoken to a civilized being in 1,000 years, so he thanks him for listening to his story. The doctor informs him that he had shared a very valuable story, thus it should be the ones thanking him. Then he leaves the room. While walking, he thinks that the boy was a very interesting patient, and his story was vividly detailed, which would have made him a great novelist. Then the scene cuts to the awakened central office, and that girl asks if they were sure the information was correct because it didn't seem right. The guy then questions what was wrong with it. The girl responds that the card said he was an F rank. The man explains that he was a rare F rank patient, and it was a shame because if he had been E rank, he would have received a government disability benefit. The girl, looking at the protagonist's card, says that if he was an F rank, it meant he was an ordinary person, wondering how he managed to pass through a portal and if they were sure it wasn't a mistake. The guy responds that he was lucky and slipped through, and by chance he found the returned stone, mentioning that he had just received the doctor's report asking if she wanted to read it. So the girl starts reading that information, as it was a common disorder among F-rank returnees. Moreover, he was behaving as if he were a wolf. Remembering the protagonist's expression, the girl wonders if it had been her imagination, asking if that was the documentation for the returnee named Park. The man confirms that it was saying that even though he was an F-rank, they still needed to treat a returnee accordingly. So, the girl asks to deliver it to him personally. However, the man wants to know why. She responds that she needed to check with her own eyes. 2 weeks had passed since he returned to Earth after spending 1,000 years in another world. He wanted to go back at any moment, but since he had returned, everything seemed very strange. For that reason, he didn't know how he should live from that day forward. Shortly after, a girl appears, mentioning that it's time for his meal. She then hands him his food, and the boy apparently was hungry, so he should eat right away. Shortly after, that other girl appears, observing the protagonist eating in a different way. Then Park notices that the girl is beside him. It is revealed that her name is Choi, and she is from the Awakened Central Office. Standing up, Park says that the scent was of a blonde person. For that reason, it seemed very familiar. Porter responds that she was the first person he had met when he returned, thinking that he definitely resembled a predator when he came out of the portal. However, perhaps there was something wrong with his sensory ability. Finishing his meal, Park says it was very tasty, asking what the Awakened Central Office was about. Then the girl asks why he was speaking so informally with her. Park replies that he was over 1,000 years old, and the girl didn't seem to believe him, saying that the Awakened Central Office was an organization designed to help returnees adjust to society. Therefore, those were the pieces of information that returnees needed to know. He could take as much time as he needed to read them. For now, he should just sigh and agree to share his information. Shortly after, Park takes the pen, saying it had been a long time since he had seen that object. Even so, after 1,000 years since he returned, they were still using that kind of tool. Shortly after, Park signs the paper. Observing the protagonist, Choi wonders if he was nothing more than an idiot. Right after, she calls the boy again. Yanana asks what she wanted. Choi asks if he had learned how to draw in that place. The protagonist replies that he already knew how to draw before. Choi asks if he had learned anything different, like magic or martial arts. Park replies no, as he had lived in a forest. To survive, he had to do many things. The girl then comments that, in order to survive, he spent 10 years running everywhere, and that to become a true returnee capable of crossing portals, it's necessary to kill monsters and steal their dimensional energy. However, she mentions that despite surviving in such a dangerous dimension, he only managed to cross the portal and find the return stone by pure luck. Park responds that he wasn't there for 10 years, but for 1,000 years. Choi, irritated, says it wasn't 1,000 years, but only 10, and that he was mistaken. Choi asks him to check his information, which indicates that he disappeared in 2015 and returned in 2025 through a portal. Looking at the data, the boy is surprised, realizing it was true. The girl then hands him his awakened identification again. As she walks away, Choi mentions that part of his expenses would be deducted due to the damage he caused, and that he should inquire about it. She also recommends that once he's recovered, he should go straight back to his family. Shortly after, Choi says goodbye and leaves. Park, for his part, is thoughtful about the girl's words. He wonders if his family would still be alive. In the past, he had given up on everything, assuming that even if he returned to Earth, his friends and family would already be dead. Now that he had returned, he had to deal with the fact that he had lost the forest family that had been with him for 1,000 years. However, that was only an assumption, as only 10 years had passed. Upon examining the documents, Park is shocked. He discovers that his parents had indeed died on that day. However, not everything was lost, as Juno, his younger brother, was still alive. Desperate, Park quickly tries to leave the hospital and rushes back to the doctor. The doctor asks if there is a problem, and Park replies that he needs his help. because his brother is still alive and he wants to know if the doctor could find him. The doctor, hesitant, says he doesn't believe Park is ready to return to society and that he would need to check the situation first. Park, impatient, responds that the doctor hadn't understood the seriousness of the situation as he wasn't there to ask for permission. At that moment, the doctor makes a gesture indicating something. He then mentions that there was a condition. Shortly after, the boy is already in a car, thanking the doctor and promising not to forget the favor. The doctor responds that they will stay in touch. Before leaving, he asks the driver to ensure Park arrives safely, as he still wasn't fully recovered. As the car drives away, the girl comments that the doctor paid all of Park's hospital expenses, as well as providing clothes and even the driver. She asks why he did all of that for Park, considering that returnees of rank X are usually neglected by the central office. The doctor replies that he wanted to keep hearing that man's story, and besides, he needed to fix the doorknob as soon as possible. The girl, surprised, remembers how the doorknob was damaged, recalling the moment when Park opened the door in a hurry. Later, the doctor is in his office, reflecting that it was the second time the doorknob had been broken. He comments that it had been a long time since he had smelled an irregular. Meanwhile, Park is still in the taxi. A news report comes on informing that at 3:00 p.m. that day, monsters had escaped in an unprotected field in the province. The error occurred due to a miscalculation in the breaking little portal. The monsters were surrounding the area. The situation was expected to be resolved in approximately 50 minutes. 2 attacks were neutralized, but 12 awakened soldiers had died. As he listens to the news, Park watches closely. A flashback of the doctor appears, where he mentions that the world had changed drastically, becoming a completely different place after the Great Disaster. The doctor comments that if he were awakened, he would have quit his mediocre job and become rich by hunting in the fields. The protagonist then asks what that was. The man responds that Park must have hit his head hard not to even know that. Park, in turn, asks him to just explain it already. 10 years ago, a door opened to the entire world. That's why that day is called the Great Disaster. It was the first dimensional convergence of their world, which connected with several others and was invaded by monsters. On that day, 10% of the world's population was lost. The military at the time wasn't enough to stop the monsters that appeared everywhere. So in regions where military strength was weak, mercenaries were sent. People who disappeared during the disaster, or the so-called awakened, received mercenary licenses and permission to hunt monsters. Park then asks how he could become a mercenary. The man bursts out laughing, saying it's difficult for an ordinary person, because first, you need to awaken. After that, you just need to pass the mercenary test at the awakened central office. The boy comments that it sounded pretty complicated. Time passes, and the boy seems to be heading somewhere. The driver informs him that they have arrived. He asks if Park can see the house in front, as that was the indicated address. Shortly after, the protagonist steps out of the car, thanking him for everything. Meanwhile, the young man walks toward the house. An elderly woman observes him from above and asks who he is. He responds that he is there for Cherno. The woman stays silent and comments that he still wears diapers, but talks as if he were an adult. Park, however, doesn't understand what she means. She responds that no one by that name lives there and asks him to leave. The boy wonders if he had come to the wrong place. However, inside the house, he hears some people arguing. Shortly after, he approaches the door. He picks up a piece of paper nearby, wondering if his brother was in debt. Sometime later, the boy is walking down the street, thinking that in the jungle, the law of the strongest prevails. But in civilized society, money is the true power. The scene then cuts to a building. Park enters and presents his awakened card. The woman informs him that his application for the mercenary test was denied because he didn't meet the requirements. Park asks what was wrong since he's an F rank awakened. The woman replies that he was classified as F rank, 4 points below the necessary level. The boy asks how that's possible, as he had crossed a portal 2 weeks ago. The woman explains that ordinary people die when they try to cross a portal, their bodies split in half. She continues, saying she doesn't believe he really did it. Either way, he could attend the awakened school or earn points in field battles and should return when he becomes a true awakened. Leaving the place, Park thinks that the system is very confusing. However, he becomes curious about the goblin field in Suwon. The scene cuts to another location. Inside a taxi, Park asks how far those walls stretch. The driver replies that they surround the entire city and then he can see it on the map app. He asks if Park has a download of the app, as the city is divided into 12 areas with hundreds of gates for transit between them. Park, observing the situation, decides he needs to immediately. Shortly after, he spots his destination, and the taxi informs him they've arrived at Suwon Field, Gate 27. The boy gets out of the car and faces a giant area. He assumes that crossing that gate would lead to a hunting ground. Shortly after, he begins walking toward the location. Two soldiers stand motionless at the site. They ask what the protagonist is doing there. He replies that he's there to hunt. One of the soldiers remains silent and asks to see his mercenary license. However, Park responds that he doesn't have one. The soldier says that ordinary civilians are prohibited from entering that area. They then notice something nearby. The other soldier requests they close the exit, but it's too late. A car appears, crashing through the site. Inside the car, a creature devours a man. As a result, the car collides with a wall. Meanwhile, the other soldier calls for the emergency squad to contain the creature. The soldiers surround the vehicle and assume combat positions. The creature exits the car. The soldiers give the order to fire and begin shooting at the monster multiple times. The creature appears to be defeated. The soldiers report that the situation has been resolved and that a monster that crossed the gate has been killed. The other soldier wonders where Park went. He wonders if Park had left the area. He probably ran away after seeing the monster. However, that wasn't the case. Meanwhile, the protagonist walks outside the area, mentioning that it was a field, but even so he could feel everything. Moreover, he would have to buy a car for himself. The boy looks around, wondering if except for the city of Seo, all the other cities were completely destroyed. For that reason, he couldn't believe it. Sometime later, night has fallen. Park mentions that the darkness felt very familiar. He starts walking among the ruins, saying it's time to hunt. Shortly after, he falls to the ground, assuming that his body felt a bit heavy. Meanwhile, he observes some buildings. Then, he begins to run quickly toward them. He successfully climbs them, reaching the top. At the top of a building, Park stood tall with the moon behind him, creating a scene that was nothing short of epic. But he wasn't there just to look cool. The protagonist closed his eyes and focused, activating his senses to figure out the best direction to take. He quickly turned his head to the side and decided to start there. He descended the building effortlessly. The grip on those shoes must be from another planet. Wandering through the empty streets, he approached a dark alley that looked suspicious. At the far end, a pack of goblins had cornered a defenseless dog, ready to make it their dinner. The drool dripping from the monsters' mouths left no doubt they were starving. But that dog wasn't going down easy. It fought with everything it had. That's when, stepping out from the shadows, our boy appeared. He looked at the dog and, in a slightly ironic tone, asked if it wanted help. Maybe the desperate look in its eyes said yes, but it didn't matter. The goblins had already made their choice. They charged at the human. Perfect. Park grinned and ran straight into the fight. In the blink of an eye, he spun around and struck from behind. The first goblin got punched so hard that its head literally sank into its own body, just like that. But then something even weirder happened. A bunch of system windows started popping up in front of him. Error messages appeared one after another, and our protagonist had no idea what was going on. The screen seemed to be saying something went wrong while recognizing his actions. While he tried to make sense of it all, the other goblins took advantage of the distraction and attacked. They were full of confidence, which was completely shattered when, one by one, they got their teeth knocked out with a single hit each. Total knockout. The last goblin, after watching the massacre of his buddies, tried to run. In a panic, he climbed up the building, but he made a fatal mistake. He stopped at the top and looked back, like he wanted to see the monster he had just faced. And he saw it. Park caught up to him, threw him off the edge, and the fall ended his life. Back on the ground, another system window appeared, warning of an error when trying to display his class abilities. That triggered a memory, about 100 years ago when he was butt naked and running through a forest trying to survive. That's when he started earning status points. Could it be that even here, on Earth, these system windows still work? And more importantly, do the errors have anything to do with his body being weaker ever since he returned to this world? Suddenly, a new window appeared titled Achievement Shop. Curious, Park decided to check it out. He had 7 points available and a few item options to buy. Nothing too flashy, but he picked a few, and like magic, the items appeared right in front of him. Before he could even taste the food, a sound caught his attention. It was the same dog from before, but this time, it wasn't alone. A puppy stood by its side. Park approached slowly, placed his hand on the dog's body, and realized it was dying. The animal, trusting its instincts, felt it could finally rest. but Park wasn't ready to let go so easily. In silence, the dog seemed to plead, "Take care of my pup." How could he forget? In the other world, wolves were his family. Maybe fate was repeating itself. He pulled a snack from his pocket and offered it to the dog. Maybe it was hungrier than Park himself. After that, he stood up and walked toward the goblin corpses scattered on the ground, 7 in total. It was still night, but it wasn't until sunrise that he finished what he had started. He made a simple grave for the dog that had died protecting its pup, and he stayed there, in silence, honoring that moment. Meanwhile, at the entrance of Area 27, traffic was chaos. Honking horns, stressed drivers trying to get through, but all that noise stopped when a figure approached, carrying several dead goblins on his back. Even though they were lifeless, the sight of those monsters made the crowd step back. The protagonist sold the bodies and got over 10 grand for the loot. The most valuable item? The crystals inside each monster. That's the real prize. Since he didn't have a bank account in his name, the payment came entirely in cash. Surprised by the amount, he started to wonder how much more he could earn if he began dungeon crawling and collecting more crystals. Elsewhere in the city, we see a truck parked near a convenience store. Inside, a man was chatting with an old friend while buying a chocolate bar for his kid. Back at the truck, the man looked cheerful. It had been a calm workday, and now all he wanted was to go home. But the peaceful vibe didn't last long. On his way back, someone suddenly called out his name, Park Jun-ho, and without warning, he took a brutal punch that sent him straight to the ground. Mentioning that it had been a long time and that they were worried because he had said he would abandon his child and run away. The man looks and seems to recognize that person. Then, the others start beating Jun-ho, Park's brother, saying that he seemed better than the last time they saw him, asking how many times he thought they had come there. Shortly after, Jun-ho takes out some money and mentions that this was the payment he had received. Counting the bills, the man says that the monthly fee was 8,000 Brazilian real, and the accumulated interest was more than 6,000 Brazilian real. So there was still money missing. With tears in his eyes, Jun-ho apologizes, saying that if he couldn't get the money, they should wait 3 days. Hitting him again, the man asks how much he thought 3 days of interest were, telling him to stop lying. At that moment, someone calls out for Jun-ho. The other man asks who that person was. Jun-ho is shocked to realize that his brother is still alive. Shortly after, Park approaches his brother and asks if he is Jun-ho. Then, a flashback shows Jun-ho being bullied by other people. Immediately after the protagonist is seen watching the situation, Jun-ho begs his brother for help. However, Park seemed to completely ignore it, leaving Jun-ho alone in that situation and walking away. Thus, his brother was never much help in his life. The flashback shows news of unknown explosions spreading across the country. Additionally, red spheres, which were portals, begin appearing along with the explosions. Jun-ho, watching all of this, is shocked. He runs toward his mother's room. His parents are happy because he was home. However, they still didn't know the whereabouts of the other brother. At that moment, an explosion occurs and several monsters begin to appear. Meanwhile, a giant eye is watching Jun-ho. Shortly after, he disappears. Returning to the present, Park seems pleased, mentioning that Jun-ho had grown since the last time he saw him. Jun-ho responds that he thought Park was dead. Immediately after, the other guy interrupts the situation. He asks if that man was really Jun-ho's older brother. At that moment, Park grabs the boy's head. In seconds, the boy is thrown back. Jun-ho watches in shock. The protagonist threw the guy so hard that he flew to the side. The two henchmen are stunned by what they just saw. Park asks if his brother is hurt. He replies that he's fine. At that moment, the other guy charges at Park. Park attempts to kick him. However, it seemed to have no effect. The man's leg simply broke. Falling to the ground, the guy begins writhing in pain. The other guy is still trembling in fear. He assumes that the protagonist is an awakened being. Shortly after, Park tells the man to come at him. However, the man responds that he hadn't hurt him. He says Park had to believe him. He told those people to leave him alone. Shortly after, Park hands some money to the man. He tells him to take the money and leave. Sometime later, night has fallen. That elderly woman appears. In front of her, the protagonist, along with his brother, watches. The woman asks if he was sure that man was his brother. Jun-ho responds that he's sure. Park, calling the woman grandma, mentions that he brought some meat. The woman says there should be contact as it's family. She asks them to hurry up because the boy had fallen asleep, waiting for his father to come home. Inside the house, a boy seems to be sleeping. Park asks Jun-ho if that was his son. Junho responds that his name is Gung-ho and that he's his only treasure. Park asks where the boy's mother was. Junho replies that she had left to live her own life, but it was his fault for not providing enough for his family. Park, trying to change his mood, says they should have a drink. Later, they are at the table drinking. Junho responds that after Park disappeared, he thought he was dead all this time, but he was alive without even having aged. Park asks how much money he owed. Junho responds that it was around 220,000 Brazilian real, but it's okay because he's sure he'll manage to handle his debts. He says he has a job now. The protagonist asks what kind of job he has. Junho responds that he works at a logistics center. Park asks if the truck was his. Junho replies that it wasn't, and that it used to belong to his grandmother's son. However, he had rented it from her. Once again, the protagonist asks what his grandmother's son used to do. Then, Junho responds that he had heard that Park had died during the Great Disaster. Shortly after, the boy wakes up, realizing there was a dog in front of him. Looking to the side, he finds his father. Junho, happy, asks if his son had already woken up. Embarrassed, the boy asks who that man was. His father replies that it was his uncle, asking him to greet him. A while later, the boy is seen playing with the dog. Junho thinks it's good to see that. The boy had always wanted a dog. Park suggests that the two of them should work together. However, Junho seems confused by this. Park responds that he will do all the work. He just asks for help with the truck. Junho, on the other hand, asks what he was planning to do. Park replies that he wants to hunt some monsters. This leaves Junho completely surprised by what he just heard. Sometime later, the scene cuts to the command center. That girl is congratulating the protagonist. The protagonist registers as an awakened being. Somehow, he had managed to increase his stats in just one day. Park asks if he is now an F-rank druid. The girl responds that now he could use his identification to open a bank account. She says he could carry out financial transactions. Handing something to him, she mentions that it was a small gift. It was for registering as an awakened being. Also, he shouldn't forget to download the Awakened Central app. She tells him to gather enough dimensional energy to become a ranker. He should be eligible for pensions and many other benefits. She asks if the protagonist knew how to open a status window. Due to recent technical issues, the interface had undergone changes. At that moment, Park says the keyword. The system screen appears, showing all his stats. Observing this, Park wonders why his stats were so low. Then, the scene cuts to the truck belonging to Park's brother. He is happy because his brother managed to get a phone. He congratulates him on officially becoming an awakened being. In the middle of the call, he says he's on his way, so he'll meet his brother there as soon as he delivers the last batch. Now that Park has become an awakened being on paper, all that remains is the mercenary test. However, Park replies that before they do that, they should pay off his debt. Juno responds that he's still an F rank, so he doesn't think they're ready to hunt monsters yet. However, the protagonist hangs up on him. Juno wonders if this was really his brother. It seemed like he had completely changed. As he walks toward the location, the protagonist says the gate seems to be closed. Meanwhile, on Route 77, a group of people seems to be in a rush because they're going to miss their game. Inside the car, a group of people seems nervous. However, the other guy tells them to relax. He asks why they're scared since they're awakened after all. He questions if they had forgotten they could officially become raiders in the guild, because if they succeeded, they'd be able to clear that dungeon. Annoyed, the other guy thinks that these people are very incompetent. They were doing it for the money and wouldn't have come this far without their connections. Shortly after, the soldier calls for the next person. Thus, the man is surprised, and the protagonist appears again in that place. The soldier asks if he's alone. Park responds that he is. Shortly after, Park places his card on the reader. The soldier begins pulling up some data on the protagonist. He asks if Park knew that was a ranking with limits, so he couldn't enter just any dungeon. Meanwhile, the man from before is observing the protagonist, who is entering that place completely alone. The other soldier asks if he thought the protagonist would be okay. After all, he didn't even have the proper equipment. However, the other guy tells him not to worry, because that was the guy who single-handedly dealt with 7 goblins at Gate 27. The other guy in the car, apparently jealous of the protagonist, wonders who he thought he was, wondering if he was going into the field like that. For that reason, he thought Park was crazy. The other soldier then apologizes for the delay, saying he was having some technical issues. Finishing the verification, the guy tells his friend to speed up, because they're going to follow the protagonist's route. However, he becomes confused because the boy had simply disappeared in the middle of that tunnel. The other guy wonders where Park had gone, and the man thinks he might have encountered something very interesting. Meanwhile, the scene cuts to the forest, and Park seems to be running through the place. Shortly after, he stops, saying that this must be the current state of his body. So, it seemed like Park had become very weak. He needed to motivate himself to improve and start training again. Looking at something, he seems surprised. He was hearing strange voices, and he guessed it could be the sound of a sword battle. A little further ahead, the boy noticed something, and he assumed that the sound was coming from that direction. Shortly after, the young man smiled, thinking that a fight between civilized beings rather than beasts could be a very good opportunity. For that reason, he couldn't afford to miss it. The scene then cuts to someone losing their arm. Above that battle, the protagonist coldly observes, and in the midst of the commotion, a group of people is being surrounded. Park, irritated, says that it seemed like it would take all day for them to start killing. Meanwhile, a man steps out of a car. He asks why it's taking so long to deal with those people. The soldier, observing the man, seems surprised. Then, irritated, the man tells them to deal with it at once. Another man says that person had a bounty of 200,000 Brazilian real on his head. Meanwhile, the protagonist is observing what the man is saying, surprised by the amount he could receive if he killed that person. The soldier, watching that man, seemed astonished. Thus, the group seemed ready to finish off those people. The man then affirms that his bounty is that amount, so they should try to catch him if they could. However, the group didn't seem very confident, wondering if, even giving their all, they would be able to win. At that moment, the man charges at the people. Within seconds, the protagonist appears, heading toward the other soldiers. The man, watching Park, becomes confused, and the other soldier wonders who that man was, who then begins walking toward the other soldier. The guy asks who he is. Park, on the other hand, asks if he really said the bounty on his head was that high. The man, confirming it, asks who the boy was, and Park responds that he was just someone who needed a lot of money. The man's subordinates wonder who this boy could be. Shortly after, the man starts laughing at the protagonist, mentioning that it seemed he wasn't part of the central office, so it would have been better for him to mind his own business. At that moment, the protagonist starts to feel something strange, wondering what was happening to his body. The man explains that Park had looked into his eyes for more than 5 seconds, which meant he would no longer be able to move. Shortly after, the man gives an order for his soldiers to charge at Park, who then point their swords at the boy. However, the protagonist is able to move again, leaving everyone completely shocked by what had just happened. With a smile on his face, Park asks if that was magic, mentioning that it was very interesting. Then the man uses his binding ability again, immobilizing the protagonist once more, who says that it was expected because he wasn't a small fly. He then draws his dagger, saying that the man should have thought twice before messing with him. But at that moment, Park strikes the man, who seems to have been injured by the attack. Park asks if he had any other tricks up his sleeve. He then punches the man, and a flurry of punches follows. The man is thrown back where he appears to have been defeated. Park, for his part, says that it was all very boring. The other guy thinks that to deal with that man so easily, Park must be incredibly strong, and he wonders who the protagonist really was. Meanwhile, the group of soldiers continues watching the boy. Park asks if they still wanted to fight. The group responds that they didn't. Shortly after, the protagonist points to a place, telling them to go there, asking if anyone happened to have a rope. One of the men responds that he had one. The protagonist then asks what there was. However, the group responds that they didn't have a bounty because they had no choice and were forced to work with that man, or they would be killed. So delivering that man would be enough to make him rich. With tears in his eyes, the man couldn't believe that his companions had betrayed him, abandoning him after he had helped them all this time. Park, for his part, asks if he had finally woken up. The group begins insulting the man, saying that he was just a piece of trash. The boy then asks if he wouldn't get anything for getting rid of those people. Then the other man mentions that they were lying, as they were all criminals too. Surely some of them must have bounties. However, the group responded that it wasn't true. They claimed they were really just useless vagabonds. Park, on the other hand, was called by the man, asking what the city's laws were that made him feel so unrestricted, because in that place, right there, the land was true freedom. So if he let him go, he would do whatever he could to make Park live like a king. But at that moment, the protagonist kicks the man again, telling him to be quiet. The man seemingly passed out. Park then asks if the man was saying that all those people had bounties on their heads. The man answers yes, since most of them were former criminals. Unhappy, The man thinks that it was his end. Park asks if there weren't too many to take with them, and the boy says they could leave them behind. The protagonist replies that it was time for everyone to take a nap. Sometime later, the scene cuts to a car driving down the road. Inside, the boy says they really needed his help, so they had to repay him somehow. However, the protagonist replies that they didn't need to do that. The other man then says that, thanks to Park, they managed to leave that place alive. Park says that if they wanted to see it that way, they could do something for him. The group then begins to ask several questions, like what his special powers and abilities were. The man responds that his awakened ability was swordsmanship, and he learned to track by investigating through skill books. Park, surprised, realizes that one could learn magic through books. The man, also surprised, asks if Park really didn't know what a skill book was. Meanwhile, the protagonist thinks it would be better to learn 1 or 2 combat magic abilities, as they could probably be useful in the future. However, something surprises him, because before him, a giant light is surrounding the area. He asks if that was a portal. The boy is surprised by the question, saying yes and mentioning that it was a level 1 dungeon, the lowest level, which is why they were planning to go there. Park says it's a pity, because he might have been able to go to that place if he at least had a mercenary license. The man, shocked by what he heard, asks if Park really didn't have a license. Park replies that he really didn't have one. When a portal opens, a military first secures the area, and any monsters found in the fields are just small fry that somehow survived the attacks. And the experience one could gain in those low-level fields, where level 1 dungeons are open and rank as E, could even allow one to surpass that level. In other words, you should actually go to level 2 dungeons. The man, still confused, wonders how this rookie, who hadn't even gone to a level 1 dungeon, managed to defeat that C-ranked man. Park, noticing the man staring at him, asks what he wanted. The man apologizes, asking if he could know what Park's rank was. Kim then informs him that it was F rank, leaving the man completely stunned by what he heard. Park then asks what favor he should request. The scene cuts to the portal from earlier. From it, a person seems to be emerging. That man from before is in the area. His group seems somewhat injured after entering the portal. As a result of everything that happened during the battle, another boy had lost his hand. For that reason, they quickly needed a doctor. The man, irritated, wonders if mercenary licenses were being handed out to anyone these days. The first thing he's going to do when he gets back to the guild is kick the person who chose those fools. However, the other boy asks him to calm down, saying he shouldn't be so hard on the rookie since he knows the guild's condition these days. Even knowing all of this, the man is still very frustrated. He thinks that people with rich parents can easily enter that place and become awakened, and after that, their parents hire mercenaries to carry them through the dungeons. Suddenly, they're ready to join the guild and go on missions. However, it's the guild members who suffer for accepting those useless people. The guy, noticing his captain's irritation, asks if they shouldn't cool their heads. That's why they should have a drink. The man then asks how everything is going as a level 1 dungeon was about to disappear. He asks if anything had happened, and a soldier responds that something big did, as someone had just delivered 10 looters to them. And among the captives, there was a rank C who had certainly heard of him. The man asked if any high-ranking individual was supposed to visit them at the camps that day. However, the soldier replied no, saying it was a rank F novice who didn't have a mercenary license and managed to capture that man. In disbelief, the man asked how that happened. The soldier answered that he didn't know the details, but according to witnesses, the rank F had simply beaten that man up. The man was then surprised, guessing it might have been the person he had seen before in the tunnel. He asked where that rank F had gone. The soldier in turn replied that he had seen him heading toward the portals. Quickly, the man headed toward the portals again, thinking he had to witness that boy's ability with his own eyes. And if it was worth it, he might gain something valuable from that story. Soon after, the man ended up getting inside a truck. The other guy then asked what the problem was. The man asked if the boy who had captured the man earlier had just entered the portal. Meanwhile, the protagonist along with his brother was entering a portal, mentioning that this time it hadn't hurt at all, and the clothes seemed to be doing fine. Junior replied that items without dimensional energy couldn't pass through the portals, but as they had just seen, those clothes passed smoothly because they were made from materials found in the dungeons. Looking to the side, Park seemed confused, asking what that thing in front of him was. Junior then responded that it was called a door, and the portal they had just entered was one of several doors that gave access to all 38 dungeons. At the same moment, the two were surprised. Park asked why the door had disappeared. Then the man answered that it would reappear once they had finished the dungeon. The protagonist asked if they had to kill all the monsters. The boy responded that no, they only had to kill the strongest one, the boss. Stretching, our boy replied that he would finish this quickly. However, Junior asked him to wait, but the protagonist didn't seem to have heard any of that, so he quickly jumped. The man, surprised, wondered who that man was, thinking he might be the guy from the rumors. With that level of power, he could very well break the record time for clearing a level 1 dungeon. However, he soon realized something, because they didn't even have tracking abilities, so they wouldn't be able to find the door's location within the time limit. Because of that, if they got stuck there, they might disappear along with the portal. Then the scene cuts back to the man with the analyzer. The door the protagonist had entered had just closed. This made the man very angry with what he had heard. Then the scene cuts back to inside the protagonist's portal. Some monsters were wandering around that place. However, one of them was suddenly hit by something and thrown back. Park, observing everything, said they were carrying very interesting things, and he began extracting the stone inside them, mentioning that there was only one blood crystal after killing 3 of them. But still, what was most important at that moment was leveling up. Meanwhile, that guy was watching everything Park had done, wondering how many monsters he had killed. Soon after, the boy ended up using his tracking ability, finding the protagonist's location, and was checking his stats, mentioning that he could buy 2 abilities with 102 achievement points. Then, he ended up buying a beast taming ability. At that moment, 2 monsters began charging toward him. Noticing this, he began immobilizing them and easily defeated them. The system notified him that he had earned the achievement. The system notified him again that there was a critical error, as a data synchronization conflict was in progress. Park, confused, wondered what that was. Then it was reported that the boy had leveled up to level 2, feeling happy because his stats had increased as usual. Because of this, he went on to buy the next Tree Spirit ability with 100 points. Then, the system notified him that he had finally acquired the ability. The boy then asked to summon the Tree Spirit. A light began to surround the place, and a kind of green spirit started to appear. Park, surprised, thought it was him. When he had seen it for the first time in the jungle, he thought it had been some kind of firefly. So, he asked the Tree Spirit to search for the missing goblins. Following the protagonist's orders, the spirit left, beginning to search for the missing monsters. Park said that the Tree Spirit transmitted the memories it read from the vegetation and trees into his mind. However, it was still a bit slow, and he wondered if it was because his level was still low. At that moment, he started to analyze his status window along with his abilities. He then noticed that he had 2 abilities, one for searching and the other for tracking. Because of this, he decided to buy both to keep improving. Immediately, he placed his hand on the ground. He began using his searching ability, stating that it was a reference point. Then he used his tracking ability, receiving the information that the goblins were already dead. However, he was surprised. Looking to the side, he assumed that it wasn't just an ordinary goblin. At that moment, he rushed toward that place, astonished by what he saw. The boy from earlier was being attacked by a different monster. Park, on the other hand, asked what he was doing. Then he smiled, happy that the protagonist had returned. The young man then asked if he hadn't said he would hunt alone. However, the young man replied that in fact, he was the one being hunted. Then he begged the protagonist for help. Immediately, the protagonist rushed toward the creature, managing to block the attack. Quickly, he recovered his stance. But within seconds, Park struck again, throwing the creature against a rock. As a result, the monster was completely covered in blood. However, there was no time to think as Park was already above him. Thus, he managed to finish the monster and the system notified that he had leveled up. He earned 120 achievement points. The young man observing the protagonist was amazed by his skills. Park then assumed that the door should have already opened. The young man confirmed that he was right. A while later, the two had already left the portal, and that group from before was watching the two of them. One of the men wondered if it was the same guy who had captured the bounty man earlier. He mentioned that Captain Kang had asked to be contacted if the protagonist returned. Looking at some information, the man wondered what the completion time for that dungeon had been. Meanwhile, the boy said he needed to return to his teammates. So, he said he would get in touch later. Park in turn confirmed this, saying he would leave all the clothes in the warehouse. The scene then shifted to that location, and Park had already changed his clothes, mentioning that he was very hungry. However, he was surprised. A man had appeared, asking if his name was Park. The boy asked who he was. The man introduced himself as Kang, the captain of the 27th combat team of the guild. He asked if he could have a few minutes of his time. Later, the protagonist and that unknown man seemed to be discussing something. Park, meanwhile, asked if he was from the Sheila Guild. The man invited him to join his guild, offering to provide an environment to help him grow. However, the boy responded that he wasn't interested in that. The man, irritated, asked what was wrong with the kid, as he was refusing to join a guild without even thinking about it. He said that if he was already associated with a guild, they could make an official offer. However, the boy responded that he wasn't in any guild. The man said that they might be in 4th place, but he needed to know that there was practically no difference in strength between the top guilds. However, the boy replied that he didn't like being under other people's. Then time passed again. Park was apparently already at home, saying it seemed like they hadn't returned yet. As he lay down, he thought they might be enjoying some quality time together as father and son. Shortly after, an old woman appeared, asking why young people these days like to disrespect time so much. The protagonist then replied that she should sit down too, as the weather was perfect for a nap. However, the woman replied that she was hanging up clothes and didn't have time for that. Seeing his grandmother doing all of that by herself, the boy ended up helping her. Then the grandmother asked if he was really Junho's older brother. The protagonist answered that he was. Soon after, the woman mentioned that it was a pleasant surprise as Benjamin was at their house. But Park responded that it wasn't true. It was the opposite. The woman replied that with all those strange monsters appearing out of nowhere and causing havoc, she thought looking younger wasn't something to be surprised about. She said she had heard it had been 10 years since he had seen his brother. Because of that, she wondered if he would take care of himself and not break his family's heart again. Hearing what the woman said, Park smiled. He asked her not to worry, saying he wouldn't die so easily. Soon after, the boy's brother, along with his son, appeared. They greeted the protagonist. Then Park handed a piece of paper to the man, who looked confused and asked what it was. Park explained that it was the money he owed, and he should use it to surround his life. He told him to pay his debt quickly so they could have dinner together. Emotional, his brother asked how he could repay such a favor. However, Park told him not to get too sentimental and that he should just go. With tears in his eyes, the man left. Park then called out to his brother again. He asked if he had enough money to buy food and drinks on his way back. The man replied that he did, and he would return before they even noticed. Park stayed on the terrace taking care of his nephew. At that moment, a system screen appeared, indicating that the target was following him and that he should name it. Park wondered what he should call the dog. The child suggested it should be named Baku. Hearing that name, Park replied that it didn't sound too bad. From that moment on, the dog would be called Baku. Time passed. The child, lying down, said he was very hungry and wondered why his father hadn't arrived yet. Noticing his brother's truck, Park assumed that his brother had already arrived, so he decided to go welcome him. Shortly after, the child, along with the protagonist, headed toward the truck. However, the man appeared, covered in blood, and collapsed on the ground. Park, seeing this, wondered why it happened. Sometime later, the scene shifted to a building at night. Meanwhile, a group of people inside the building seemed to be playing a card game. One man asked if the fight should start that week. Another man replied yes, saying that he'd seen all the online communities were betting on the man named Miho. The man asked if there was any news from Horizon, as last time they went there, it lost a lot of money. At that moment, someone was banging loudly on the door. Irritated, the man asked what the noise was. Then, the other men stood up to see what the commotion was. At that moment, the door burst open, and a silhouette of a man appeared, completely covered in blood. Immediately, someone grabbed the head of the man, dragging him out of the door. The men, watching the situation, wondered why it happened. Then, a piercing gaze was directed at the door, and from that point, chaos erupted. The group, shocked, couldn't understand what was happening. Within seconds, a cabinet and a weapon were thrown in their direction. A commotion broke out. Several people were thrown around. The boss, watching it all, was surprised as the protagonist had taken down everyone in a matter of seconds. Another man asked if he knew who that person was. The man replied that he seemed to be awakened. At that moment, the protagonist threw a table at the man. Immediately after, he climbed on top of it, asking if his name was Kim. Irritated, the man said that was indeed his name, demanding to know who the protagonist was. The boy replied that someone wanted to settle Park Jong-ho's debt. The man said he must be insane, asking if he called himself awakened after beating up honest, hard-working people. He told him not to think he would get away with it. At that moment, the man received a slap to the face. Park asked what that had to do with it, and why he slapped him just because he wanted to pay off his debt. He said all he should have done with his brother was take the money and leave. He asked why he had crossed the line and done that to his own brother. As he received the slaps, the man begged to be left alone. Park, in turn, asked if he wanted to settle the debt or get beaten until he died. Without even thinking, the man said he would settle everything at once. A while later, the entire group was kneeling before Park, saying that from that moment on, their client, John Rodham, would no longer have any obligations to them and all his debts would be paid. Park then replied that if they ever saw them again, they should consider themselves dead. He told them to make sure not to cross his path. Kneeling, they all confirmed what the boy had said. However, one of the men still didn't seem to have given up. Sometime later, the man mentioned that the protagonist had already left. Irritated, the man, plotting his plans, wondered if the boy really thought he didn't have people backing him. Once again, the scene shifted to a building, and that guild leader from earlier mentioned that he had found new talent. He asked to take a look at this person, that he showed some information about Park. However, the man noted that he was just a rank F, and besides that, he had registered as an Awaken only that day. The other man said that was all more reason to be interested, as they could take a closer look at his profile. But the system notified that access had been denied. They wondered what kind of person he was. However, they managed to bypass the security and access the information. They still wanted to know why his profile was confidential. It seemed he hadn't joined a guild yet, and there appeared to be more to his story. Then, the man asked to check his abilities. The boy mentioned that he was a type of conjurer. Moreover, he had previously defeated a man with a high bounty in a very easy manner. He asked if they knew that this man had been missing for 10 years, which made the situation strange. They wondered if he might be a special agent. The man then said he thought he would be strong because of his abilities, and never considered he might be a member of an intelligence service. The boy then said they should give up on recruiting this person because he was 100% certain that he belonged to another country. He mentioned that he knew this would happen the moment there was all that fuss. Wanting to change the subject, the other man suggested they go have coffee. He asked why a special agent would have entered a level 1 dungeon. The boy asked why it mattered so much. Again, the man asked him to keep an eye on the protagonist, but the boy seemed reluctant to do so. The scene then shifted to a hospital. The protagonist was visiting his brother, asking if he was awake yet. Juno then noticed that his brother had arrived, asking why he had bought so much food. Juno replied that he had heard he ate a lot, and it helped with recovery. Park, in turn, asked if he was feeling better. Juno responded that he would be able to remove his bandages the next day. He then asked if his mercenary test was tomorrow. The boy replied that it was. Juno said it would be great if he could pass the test and be invited to a guild. However, the protagonist didn't seem to want that. He thought to himself that he had once been the king of the forest. For that reason, he couldn't join a group and become someone's lackey. Juno then asked that he should look into some high-ranking guilds for him to join. The boy replied that there was no need because he would make his own guild. In disbelief, Juno asked if he was really going to create a guild instead of joining one. Sometime later, the scene shifted to the adventurer's agency. Meanwhile, Shui seemed to be walking through the building. Shortly after, an older man called out to her. He asked what had happened to her in recent days. He mentioned that there had been 2 breaches in her area, and if yesterday's portal had been a bridge portal, the city would have been in ruins by now. The girl then asked if they couldn't do anything without her. However, the man asked her to help because the portal department manager had been bothering him all day. What he was trying to say was that she was wasting her talent, but the girl replied that it had been hard to stay focused lately. Handing her a paper, the man told her to stop talking nonsense and read it at once. Shui, in turn, was surprised because they had sent her to do manual labor when she thought she was finally going to have a break. But the man replied that she wasn't the only one and it wasn't the first time anyway. Immediately after, the girl, irritated, began to leave the place. The man asked her not to go around rejecting candidates just because she was upset. He reminded her that they were short on people and needed every person they could get. Shui replied that it was better to reject those idiots who couldn't protect themselves. Shortly after, the scene shifted to another location. A group of people was discussing how they needed to pass that test. Meanwhile, a man appeared doing a live stream on YouTube. Everyone in that place was eager to take the test to get their mercenary license. Soon after, a different group of people entered the area. The man noted that they would have to end the stream because the test was about to begin. At that moment, the protagonist appeared staring at that boy. The boy then asked if it was the first time Park was watching the live stream. Park asked who he was talking to as the boy requested some space. Soon after, the supervisor introduced himself, saying he would be in charge of everything for the next 3 days. The 21 supervisors present that day would evaluate whether they had what it took to pass the test. He'd assume that everyone had received a ticket with their number upon arrival. They would begin the selection of supervisors through a random draw, so when their name was called, they were to form a single line in front of their supervisor. Time passed and many people were called, until it was the protagonist's turn who received number 15. However, he was surprised by something. His supervisor would be that blonde girl from before. Observing her, he mentioned it had been a long time since he had seen her. The boy recognized her immediately, and the man asked them to head to their respective waiting rooms and rest until further announcements were made. Meanwhile, the boy who had been streaming earlier was heading to the location, bragging to his viewers that it would be tough to pass the test. However, he seemed like he would leave the next day. It was then revealed that the streamer from earlier was also in the room where the protagonist was. Looking to the side, he noticed the boy, asking why he looked so sad when he had been so excited earlier. Looking at the protagonist, he realized it was the same guy from before, asking if he ever heard about that blonde girl's craziness because there was a reason everyone called her a witch. That girl was the type to eliminate someone just because she was having a bad day. Park, in turn, asked why it was the supervisor's fault and not the fault of those who weren't prepared. Irritated, the boy thought that Park had just ignored his words, knowing from the start he was useless, asking if he cared to show respect to his seniors. However, the protagonist replied that if he had a problem, he should solve it like real men with a fight. The boy then asked if he thought he was easy prey. Quickly, Park responded that he did. Irritated, the boy said he was going crazy and told Park to follow him. Meanwhile, Choi had arrived at the location. However, she noticed that no one was there. Annoyed, she wondered where everyone had gone. The scene then cut to a ring arena, and the protagonist, along with the boy, was preparing for a fight. The boy said that Park was very unlucky because he should have fought twice before wanting to fight him, asking if he had never heard of TV Kaboo since despite appearances, he was a promising YouTuber, and however, Park seemed unaware of what that was asking if it was some kind of food. This made the boy even more irritated, and he mentioned that he would have to teach Park a lesson. Everyone in the stands was very excited about the fight, fully cheering for the streamer, saying one of his hobbies was teaching manners to disrespectful kids like Park. Watching all of this, the protagonist remarked that everything seemed quite fun. The streamer then warned Park not to ask him to cover his hospital expenses after he was done with him. At that moment, he charged at the protagonist, throwing a punch. However, Choi appeared at the scene, ordering everyone to return to the waiting room immediately. As a result, the group hurriedly left. Watching the protagonist and the man, Choi asked if they were desperate to fail the test, and she didn't need an explanation. One of them just had to take the blame. Whoever lost would fail the test, and they should continue the fight. The streamer, watching this, thought it was expected because that woman was crazy. Then Park prepared for the battle. The streamer asked him not to be nervous, reminding him that it was the protagonist who had asked for this. Park, in turn, apologized for what was about to happen. At that moment, the boy charged at Park, but within seconds, he was struck by a punch and was quickly knocked out. Choi, watching this, was surprised, thinking that ever since the day she met him, she had felt an uncomfortable sensation that wouldn't go away. Park, looking at Choi, asked why she seemed so distracted, saying that if she won a fight too, she should get into the ring. However, he had one condition. If he won, she couldn't disqualify the other guy. Choi, in turn, said the boy must be crazy. Then she entered the ring, asking if the young man was perhaps an irregular. However, Park didn't know what that meant and asked who it was. Then the girl lunges at the protagonist, who manages to dodge the attack. Thus, Choi starts attacking the young man repeatedly. He seemed to only be on the defensive. Just as she was about to attack again, Choi says that if he wins, she would grant him that request. However, she ends up receiving a fatal blow from the girl, thinking something was wrong because he was definitely hiding something. Shortly after, she is surprised, and the protagonist responds that she was stronger than he had thought. The girl is then surprised because Park was able to withstand her attack. At that moment, she charges at him again, saying that this time it was really over. She gets the boy with another attack, following up with a series of attacks on him. However, out of nowhere, he seems to start fighting back. Thus, he lands a punch on the girl, even managing to break her shield. However, it still wasn't enough. But even so, she was surprised that Park was able to break her shield. Shortly after, the boy charges at her again, declaring that this was a lot of fun. Choi, for her part, says that he really was an irregular. Park, still confused, asks what that meant. Then the girl responds that she surrenders. The protagonist, confused, asks why, since the fight was just getting good. The girl replies that the place was too small to use her abilities and that they should fight in a larger area next time. Park, on his part, asks if there were strong girls like her on Earth, to which Choi responds there weren't many. Shortly after, the protagonist says he chooses her, and for that reason, they should make babies, asking if she wanted to mate with him. However, the girl slaps him across the face. Meanwhile, that streamer finally wakes up, wondering what had happened. At the same time, Choi was very irritated by that and starts walking away. That guy was still surprised, as he had been knocked out with just one punch. For that reason, he should go home, since he wasted money on the application without even taking the test, mentioning that it was very embarrassing. Looking at the protagonist, the young man still seemed angry, asking if he was satisfied with that. However, Park responds that he hadn't been disqualified. Meanwhile, the camera was watching them, and the scene cuts to an old man looking at a computer, completely surprised that Choi had lost. Park then calls the streamer to leave together. However, he was still confused, asking why he hadn't been disqualified. Park informs him that he had asked Choi to ignore his disqualification. The streamer still wanted to know why the protagonist got slapped, but the boy responds that he didn't mean to know that. Shortly after, the young man seems to have realized something, supposing that he had been hit because of him. That's why he convinced the girl to ignore the commotion by letting her hit him. Realizing this shortly after, the guy starts to follow Park. At that moment, someone on the intercom calls Park, asking him to go to the supervisor's office as soon as possible. A while later, our protagonist is in the supervisor's office, discussing with him, asking why he had called him. The man then says that before they talk, he should know that everything was being recorded, and that he had seen his fight with Supervisor Choi, and for that reason, he was surprised that a candidate like him managed to go up against a rank B awakened, asking if the boy was, by chance, an awakened. However, Park still didn't know what that was, mentioning that they had already asked that question twice. The man observing the situation supposes that Park needed more information about the portals. The pit portals connect Earth to 3 other planets. The first was called Aruka, which was the home planet of elves and dwarves. Additionally, that planet had relations with Earth, and from time to time they made exchanges, and the humans who returned from their learned skills related to magic and artifact creation. The next planet was called Gukjin, inhabited by Mimonas and martial artists, who were constantly fighting for their planet's sovereignty. Those martial artists were their allies, while the Mimonas were their enemies. And the last planet was called Meter, a place dominated by orcs. And to make matters worse, that planet was also infested with ferocious monsters. Among the Earthlings who returned from those 3 planets, there are those who learned extremely powerful abilities, and they discovered that their combat power exceeded that of the Awakened. That's why they decided to classify them as irregulars. Hearing the whole story, Park says it was too complicated, but he was sure that the place where he had been wasn't any of those 3 planets. The supervisor on his part is confused by what he heard, wondering if by chance he was a dungeon returnee, questioning which planet the boy had returned from. Park says that he had already told the previous doctor that he had lived with wolves for over 1,000 years. A while later, the protagonist had finished telling his story. The supervisor then thanks him for sharing, so he could return to his waiting room. Shortly after, the protagonist leaves the room. However, the supervisor says that the story was too absurd to be true. At that moment, a man appears in the room introducing himself, saying that he heard he had been called. Then, the boss asks if he could take over as the supervisor of room 15. The man asks if that wasn't the area Captain Choi was in charge of. Confirming it was, the man informs him that she had fled, but the details didn't matter, and he wanted him to monitor candidate Park and then provide a detailed report on him when his test was over. Meanwhile, the protagonist was already in that room with all the candidates waiting for the test to begin. Shortly after, everyone alongside their captains was lined up, and that man from earlier really took over as the supervisor of room 15. The streamer, observing this, asks if Choi had been fired by chance. Then, the man introduces himself, saying his name was Sang, and that he was in charge of supervising Team 15. The minimum requirement for that day's physical test was 9 seconds and a 100-meter dash and an hour to complete the triangle. Shortly after, the test had already begun, and several people were being disqualified quickly. The girl then says that for a healer, there should be an easier test. Sang asks if she thought the monsters would go easy on her, just because she was a healer. Thus, the man calls the next candidate. Han is then introduced, saying that 9 seconds was too easy, saying that he would see the protagonist in the next round. Then, Sang gives the signal and Han starts running. The supervisor says that it took a total of 8 seconds, and for that reason, he passed the test. Then, the next candidate is called and the protagonist is preparing. Meanwhile, Han is cheering for the boy, and when the race starts, Park begins to run in a matter of seconds. Everyone around is completely astonished by what they had seen. Shortly after, the director receives a call from someone, saying it was Sergeant Kim, mentioning that the result of candidate Park Soo-ho's physical test had just come out, and that it was quite surprising. Back at the test, there were some reporters taking pictures and recording Park because he was quite impressive. At the same time, another person receives a call, and the girl says she is Miso from the association and the director of the returnee center. The supervisor on the call says he will send some videos of Park, and for that reason, she needed to watch them. Watching those videos, the girl seems surprised. The other guy mentions that Major Young had the ability to detect lies, so they could say that the protagonist had told the truth in that interview. Miso, on the other hand, still didn't believe that the doctor's report was true. To that limit, the boy was probably an irregular, so he had to be at least stronger than a rank B. For that reason, if his story was true, it meant that Park Soo-ho might return from a 4th planet. Shortly after, Miso asks him to make sure no reporters appear at the training grounds again. However, that guy seems surprised, mentioning that it was already too late because the protagonist had already appeared in the news. At that moment, Miso asks to remove all those articles immediately. Then, the scene cuts to several photographers taking some pictures of someone. Meanwhile, the protagonist, alongside Han, was walking down the street. Miso, for her part, thinks that it meant Park somehow managed to maintain his physical status, despite passing through a portal without protective equipment, wondering if, by chance, he was given an F ranking due to his lack of dimensional energy. In any case, if he really had returned from a 4th planet, South Korea might gain an advantage. Regarding the development of the unknown 4th planet, meanwhile, several reporters were trying to enter a certain location. Above there, many participants from the test were eating. Meanwhile, Park, along with Han, was eating as well. Han, surprised, thinks that not just anyone could knock him out on the first try. Noticing Han staring at him, Park asks what's wrong and if he had finished eating already. Han responds that it was nothing, asking if the boy was thirsty, as he would get water for him, thinking that just by watching the builder eat, one could tell that he was on a completely different level. For that reason, he was sure that Park would be a big deal in the future. Shortly after, time passes and Park seems to be about to sleep. Han says that seeing how those lockers were empty, he imagined that the rest of the people had failed the test. For that reason, they were going to be in a lot of trouble. Park asks why he thought that. The guy responds that the next part of the test involved incursions and dungeons, so teams with more members had an easier time, while those with fewer struggled. However, Park tells him not to worry about that, as they didn't need more people. Hearing what the boy said, Han is surprised, thinking he was very good. However, the situation was different, as dungeons had many unpredictable factors, so he thought it would be easier to have more people with different abilities. Park says he had already told him not to worry, and more importantly, asks what he was doing with his phone when he saw him for the first time. The boy then responds that he was streaming on YouTube, asking if by chance Park didn't know about it. Asking if he lived in a cave, the protagonist responds yes, as it was pretty much like that. Taking out his phone, Han says that it was called YouTube. Thus, he begins to show him all the features it had. Shortly after, Park says that he was really a good person. A while later, the two had already left the house, and the boy thinks that his partner had everything it took to become the next YouTube star. Moreover, he was quite a stud and had a perfect body, which is why he even appeared in the headlines for breaking a world record. For that reason, if Park demonstrated combat power in dungeon incursions, it would probably be just a matter of time before he caught the attention of all the guilds. Then Park responds that he really liked the boy, asking him to join his clan. Han, surprised, asks if, by chance, he was planning to create his own clan, and if he wasn't interested in joining a guild. However, the young man responds that he didn't want that. Han, for his part, wondered what would happen if he made a video about the clan's creation, and went on dungeon incursions with the best candidate from the year's mercenary test. Shortly after, the scene cuts to the boy falling to the ground. Boxing was the only thing that helped him endure that rotten childhood he had. Despite continuing to fail, he managed to get professional license. Even so, he would lose hope, but great disasters shatter all of his hopes and dreams. And they say hope is the last thing to die, which is why he ended up becoming a YouTuber. Back in the present, Han thinks that this was what he had been looking for, as he couldn't believe such an opportunity was right in front of him, saying he was willing to do anything for the protagonist. Park, please, says he's starting to liken more so he should about the stream. With tears on his face, the guy says he wouldn't go back on his word. Park, for his part, asks why he suddenly started crying, and Han replies that it was nothing, asking if he knew that he needed at least 3 members for a clan to be officially created. However, Park still didn't seem to know that. Shortly after, an unknown man enters the room. Han then asks why that monk was in that place. Then the man introduces himself, saying his name was Miyuki Jin and that he was assigned to Team 15. At that moment, a device rings, saying that candidates should put on their battle suits. They were to meet in the 3rd floor conference room within 30 minutes. Park, along with Han, watches in surprise, wondering if they really wanted them to put on those suits at such an hour of the night. The protagonist asks if they weren't going into the dungeons the next day. Miyuki Jin responds that it was said that sometimes the Reapers made dungeon incursions at night without any prior notice. Han replies that it was crazy because they were doing it without warning. Then the scene cuts to the room with all the students, saying that the dungeon would be part of the test, and it was located in the 5th sector of Seoul, which was under the Phoenix Guild's protection. For that reason, it was a level 1 dungeon with a total of 250 doors. Park, for his part, asked what it meant to be under protection. Han, in disbelief, was still surprised because the protagonist really didn't know anything. With doors appearing everywhere, the South Korean government found it difficult to manage all of them, so the government hired private mercenary clans to protect the 12 sectors. The guild is the name given to a private mercenary clan contracted by the government in exchange for its services. Guilds gain rights to process the dimensional energy of the dungeons they manage. Park, for his part, asks if it was basically a tax-free zone where they could hunt, and Han responds that it was pretty much like that. The boy thinks he just wanted to form a clan because he missed hunting with his pack. However, now he could even get his own land. Han replies that it was great to have his own dungeon because that way he wouldn't have to pay to use it. Park replies that the goal of his clan was to become a guild. However, Han asks if they shouldn't worry about passing the mercenary test first, wondering if the protagonist was pretending to be dumb. Shortly after, that guy says that this was an image of the portal's location in Sector 5, and that dungeon had only 15 days left before it broke. It was a labyrinth-type dungeon, which had the lowest difficulty level and the fewest monsters of all the dungeons. It was a shame they wouldn't be able to obtain much dimensional energy since the monsters there were extremely weak. Anyway, that was all the man had to say about the dungeon's explanation. Han wonders what that was about because the monsters might not be their biggest problem. If they weren't careful, they could end up getting stuck in the labyrinth. For that reason, if they at least had a tracking ability, half of their problems could be solved. However, Park replies that he had that ability, leaving the boy very surprised by what he heard, wondering if he had really learned that ability before taking the mercenary test, because that ability was extremely expensive, supposing that the protagonist was probably from a rich family and born with a silver spoon in his mouth. Meanwhile, that monk was still standing next to Park. Then Han asks if he had any awakened abilities. Thus, the man remains silent, leaving the two confused by the situation. At that moment, he pulls out some kind of tool. The seaman cuts to a flashback of him. Several monsters surround that house, which quickly advance towards the place, heading toward the monk, starting to completely destroy the house. Shortly after, another monk opens the door and asks them to stop the noise immediately. Maya and Jin ask what he was doing at that hour of the night. The man then requests that the priest be taken with him and the area be evacuated immediately. At that moment, a monster appears behind him and it is swiftly defeated by him. Back in the present, that man seemed to have a frightened expression. Han asks why he looked so scared. The other man then replies that from that moment on, they were going to the marked target. Therefore, they should begin attacking the dungeon as a team led by the supervisor. He hoped that everyone would pass the test and that no one would fail. Shortly after, everyone was heading toward the portal. The soldiers asked everyone to get off the bus, asking if everyone was prepared. Once they entered, they were to act as if they weren't there and follow the agreement. Han says that his team was the only one with 3 members, so he asks if, in case things got dangerous, the supervisor would really help them. However, the man ignores the question and tells them to move quickly. Then Park asks why Han is so scared. He asks if they were allowed to use their personal weapons. The soldier responds that they were. Surprised, Han wonders if that monk had a weapon made of dimensional material for the mercenary tests. Meanwhile, the entry of each group into the portal was being completed. Soon after, the soldier tells the group to enter. Thus, Team 15 enters the portal. Han wonders why Park always goes ahead, which makes him nervous. He asks the boy to establish a perimeter first, but at that moment, he falls silent, thinking he had lost points for not entering quietly and not holding his position. As a consequence, he ends up attracting the attention of monsters, and one is already in front of the protagonist. Within seconds, the boy grabs the monster and defeats it. Han comments that making noise to catch them off guard and lure them into a trap could be a good idea. He asks if the boy was using tracking while advancing, but at that moment, he steps on a trap, and within seconds, several arrows begin to be fired at them. The scene cuts to a dragon being showered with gunfire. That monk had apparently defeated all the monsters around. With tears in his eyes, he apologizes, saying that it was all his fault. Thus, the monster is obliterated. The scene cuts back to Park's fight. Han, observing the protagonist's skills with the staff, mentions that he was very good. However, he steps on another trap, and as a result, they fall to the floor below. The door apparently closes, leaving everyone trapped in a dungeon. Looking up, they all realize the opening had been sealed. Han, desperate, wonders if this is how all his dreams disappeared, and if they were really going to die there. But in that same instant, he realizes something, saying that they thought they had really attracted more monsters. Then the monk apologizes, mentioning that his awakened ability was an area-wide provocation, which, as a consequence, attracted the attention of the monsters. Park says that's great because he was too lazy to hunt for all the monsters to kill. Shortly after, he jumps out of the dungeon, leaving Han surprised, wondering how someone could kick so hard. Park says he really liked the monk and that he should join his clan. However, that man still didn't seem to understand the situation. Shortly after, a massive horde of monsters appears. Park observes them coldly, and Han begins to use his tracking ability. Seeing all the targets in front of him and all the traps around, he quickly starts running. Han thinks that they really messed up. Then, that monk points his staff at Han, asking him to grab it and climb out. Han says he didn't know anything anymore, as the operation was not what they had planned. When they stand up, they are surprised because the horde of monsters had already been defeated by Park. Observing this, the boy thinks it's insane. Park then asks them to follow him and be careful with the ones who are knocked out. The two do as the boy asked, starting to defeat the remaining monsters. Surprised, the monk wonders if the protagonist was avoiding the traps or using tracking. For that reason, he was advancing at incredible speed, decimating the monsters while using the traps to his advantage. Looking up, he sees a monster behind the protagonist. However, the monk saves him, throwing his staff toward the skeleton. Shortly after, the system informs Park that he acquired 42 conquest points. The scene cuts to an agency. The other soldier says that a team is returning from the dungeon, and the other soldier is surprised because only a few minutes had passed since the test began. He mentions that the dungeon usually takes 2 hours to finish, wondering if an accident had occurred. However, the man says it was Team 20 and all vital signs were normal. Shortly after, that gentleman receives a call. Answering it, he says it was the supervisor asking why they were returning so early, and the soldier on the other end of the line confirms that they had completed the mission. He would understand when he watched the video, but it would be difficult to assess his performance in a level 1 dungeon. Additionally, Park had broken a performance record inside the dungeon. The scene then cuts to the city. Han starts a live stream saying they would be doing daily streams about his clan. One of the viewers asks what they would show today, and the boy replies that they were going to watch the video of Su Clan's house together, as it would be uploaded soon. He then shows where each person's dormitory was. Next, he goes to the protagonist's grandmother's house, asking her to take a look at his subscribers. The grandmother, irritated, says she had many things to do instead of worrying about that. She tells the boy to leave before she slices him. Hearing this, Han falls silent, thinking she wasn't usually like that. She was actually a very nice person. Then Han heads to the room where the protagonist and the monk are. In the middle of the stream, Han introduces the saying his name was Myung-jin. He asks the boy to say something to introduce himself. The monk replies that he had lost a lot in the attack of the evil spirits, but was left with a staff of clairvoyance that his eldest disciple had left behind. At that moment, a truck arrives at the house, hence the protagonist's brother asking if he was ready. So everyone starts heading toward the truck. As they go to the location, a drone flies overhead. Park wonders what that thing flying was, and if he should destroy it. Han is surprised as he didn't know. He says that at the moment they were heading to the mission area in Area 4 of Gate 30. That nearby portal meant that today was their first dungeon mission as a clan. Returning to the stream, the boy asks if his subscribers knew that he had an awakened ability that was video memory. So they shouldn't panic because soon there would be an even better video. Sometime later, the protagonist and his group had already entered the dungeon. Han asks if the boy had any long-range abilities, and the protagonist replies that he didn't. Han, confused, asks how they were going to deal with those bats without such an ability. However, the monk tells him to leave it to him. At that moment, he starts beating on some kind of drum, making a deafening noise. As a result, the entire horde of bats begins moving toward them. Han, surprised, wonders why they were coming out like that. Shortly after, those bats head toward the monk, where he apparently starts using a fire ability. However, it wasn't over yet as a giant bat appears, but it was no use because Park had already sliced it in half. Thus, the mission seemed to be complete. Park mentions that the gate had opened, so they should hurry. Observing all the madness that had happened, the viewers seemed quite in disbelief. Then, the scene cuts to Mizra's office, who apparently wasn't believing what she was seeing. The other guy says that with the thirst those people had in Area 4, the three of them were capable of finishing even 20 dungeons a day. Moreover, they were completely decimating all the level 1 dungeons. Taking out his phone, he observes that streamer's channel from earlier. Mizra says that she had done a lot to keep the protagonist out of the news, but unfortunately, one of his guild members was a streamer. The mentions that Park's videos were now ranked 3rd in real-time popularity, so if they left it alone, it would only grow more, asking if they shouldn't take some precautions. The girl, for her part, says that she was well aware of that. Meanwhile, she seemed to be watching a video of the fight between two people, and that guy seemed to have easily won the battle. The other person watching was named Lee Sung-woo, an SS rank irregular born in South Korea. Wondering what would happen if the country approached him carelessly under the pretext of protecting a talent and ended up having to deal with the second Lee Sung-woo. She stands up, asking them to prepare to make contact with the protagonist, and for that reason she would meet him personally. Shortly after, the scene cuts back to the protagonist's house. Han, for his part, asks if the monk didn't have work to do. Park wonders where he would go as he didn't have a temple of any sort. Junho replies that he had mentioned he was living in Seoul with a temple family that survived that day. Noticing Han's irritation, Junho asks if the creature couldn't at least rest for a day, since his clan was ready to renew its rank. Moreover, his clan's account had already accumulated 140 million won in total, leaving the boy very surprised by what he had heard. Thinking that he had done nothing but gather the blood crystals, yet his account already had 20 million in 3 days. Park, observing this, remains silent, and the boy continues saying it was insane because if it were true, they would get many donations. Park thinks that he had earned more than 3,000 conquest points, so he should buy some varied abilities since he could get everything now. Thus, he responds that he would take that day to rest. Standing up, Junho says he would take his son and grandmother to the park near that place. Meanwhile, that elderly woman seemed to be feeding the dog. Observing the little dog, Park wonders if dogs, by chance, could awaken like humans. Shortly after, he calls for his brother, mentioning that he had been fixing the truck quite often and asking if it wasn't difficult. Junho replies that he didn't even know where to start and that it was already hard enough to find the parts, but fixing it was exhausting. Then Park asks if he didn't want to buy a new car, leaving Junho very happy with what he had heard. Sometime later, the two seem to be discussing with the manager about which car to get. The man starts explaining the car many times in detail. Park asks if his brother liked it, and Junho quickly responds that he did. With his choice made, Park says he intends to pay in cash, asking if they could drive off immediately. Shortly after, the two leave the place with their new car. Junho seems very happy, saying that the car was incredible and was on a completely different level compared to what he had before. Park mentions that even the passenger seat in that car was amazing and he should have bought it a long time ago. Junho then asks why they were heading to Area 34, wondering if it wasn't a restricted area. The protagonist questions if he had mentioned that he couldn't awaken because he didn't have the money, and for that reason they were going to awaken that day. Shortly after, a scene cuts to the two arriving at the predetermined location. Looking around, there were several destroyed houses. Meanwhile, Junho didn't seem confident about the situation, and the other dog appeared to be on high alert. Park asks if the dog could also sense that smell, because that odor was definitely from a goblin. Junho replies that he wasn't feeling comfortable and asks if they could leave. Shortly after, Park steps out of the car, saying he would be back soon so they should wait with the dog, and he quickly jumps away from the place. Junho didn't seem very pleased with that. Shortly after, the scene cuts to another location. A group of people appeared to be watching the video of the protagonist with his group. The other man says that he was very popular on YouTube, saying that he was an irregular, which is why his combat level was immeasurable. vulnerable. Then the other man says that if he was at that level, he was useless to even hire an assassin. However, even so, they couldn't just leave him alone. The other guy then asks for a list of guilds in Area 4 that had frequent sponsorships. Thus, he remembers the name Shui. But there was another person who was better suited for the situation, asking to contact him and offering as much money as necessary for the job.